The wind did not howl across the Texas panhandle. It screamed. It was a living thing, a shapeless beast with invisible claws that raked against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin, seeking a way in to steal the last remaining warmth. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, cured leather, and the sour, milky scent of desperation. Tybo sat on the packed earth floor, his back against the wall where the chinking was thickest. In the crook of his arm lay Connie. The boy was so small, a bundle of rags and rabbit fur that weighed no more than a winter-starved hare. The name meant Little Star. But tonight the star was fading, its light sputtering in the vast, consuming dark of the prairie winter. It was late, perhaps 2 or 3 in the morning. Tybo did not need a clock to know the hour. He measured time by the rhythm of the baby's breathing and the depth of the cold settling into his own bones. The fire in the stone hearth was a miserable, sulking thing, fed by green wood that hissed and popped rather than burned. It cast long, dancing shadows that looked too much like the ghosts Tybo had spent a lifetime trying to outride. He looked down at his son. Connie was not crying anymore. That was what terrified Tybo the most. Earlier in the evening, the infant had wailed with a jagged, rasping sound that tore at Tybo's nerves, a sound of hunger that could not be satisfied. Now, the boy just whimpered, his tiny chest hitching with shallow, rapid breaths. His lips were pale, cracked like the dry mud of the Red River bank in August. Drink, Tybo whispered, the English word feeling heavy and clumsy on his tongue. He switched to Comanche, the language of his blood, soft and low. Drink, little one, you must fight. He held a wooden spoon to the boy's mouth. Inside was a thin, gray gruel rice water mixed with the last of the goat's milk. He had traded a good saddle blanket for the goat 3 weeks ago, thinking it would save them. But the goat was old, its milk bitter and scant, and Connie's stomach turned against it. Every time Tybo managed to dribble a few drops past the infant's gums, the boy would gag, his small body convulsing in a rejection that felt like a physical blow to Tybo's chest. The liquid spilled over the baby's chin and soaked into the dirty wool of the blanket. Tybo wiped it away with a thumb calloused by reins and bowstrings. His hand was large, scarred from battles with the Ute and the blue-coated cavalry. A hand designed to grip a lance or break a horse. It was a hand of destruction, useless for this delicate, life-sustaining task. He felt a surge of anger, hot and sudden, followed instantly by a crushing wave of shame. He was a warrior. He had ridden with the lords of the plains. He had stolen horses from under the noses of sleeping guards and hunted buffalo when the herds blackened the horizon. He could survive blizzards that killed cattle by the thousand. He could find water in the dust. But here, in this drafty box of timber and mud, he was defeated. He was losing a battle against an enemy he could not strike, could not shoot, could not outrun. He was a warrior who had won on the battlefield but was losing in the kitchen. He set the spoon down on the floor and pulled the furs tighter around the infant. The movement disturbed the air, and the candle flame on the upturned crate flickered, threatening to die. Tybo stared at the flame. It was weak, just like the life in his arms. "Your mother would know," he murmured to the silence. The memory of her was a sharp pain behind his eyes. She had died 7 days after Connie was born. It wasn't the birth that took her, but the fever that came after, riding in on the first hard freeze of the season. She had been strong, stronger than him in ways that mattered. She had made this cabin a home, hanging dried herbs from the rafters and sewing deerskin curtains to keep out the drafts. When she died, the warmth went with her. She left him with a screaming infant and a silence so loud it drowned out his thoughts. He remembered her face as the fever burned her away, her skin tight against her cheekbones, her eyes bright and glassy. "Keep him warm." "Tybo," she had whispered, "do not let the cold take him. Promise me." He had promised, and now he was breaking that promise. The baby shifted, letting out a weak, dry cough. Tybo stood up. He could not sit still. The inaction was driving him mad. He began to pace the small length of the cabin, the floor hard under his moccasins. 4 steps to the door. Turn. 4 steps to the hearth. Turn. He rocked the baby gently, a rhythmic motion that was more for his own comfort than the child's. He needed to do something. He needed to find a solution. He had tried the willow bark tea the old women used to make, but Connie would not swallow it. He had tried soaking bread in water until it was mush, but the boy choked. He had prayed to the spirits of the wind and the earth, and he had even awkwardly mumbled a prayer to the white man's god that his wife had sometimes spoken of. The only answer was the wind rattling the door latch. He stopped at the single window of the cabin. It was covered by a heavy shutter, but there was a crack where the wood had warped. Tybo put his eye to the gap, squinting into the night. Outside, the world was a void of gray and black. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of storm clouds. The ground was a treacherous slurry of half-frozen mud and old snow. But in the distance, perhaps 2 miles away across the rolling, empty scrubland, there was a light. It was faint, a pinprick of yellow against the obsidian dark. The Mayfield homestead. Tybo knew the place. Abel Mayfield was a sodbuster, a man who broke the earth with a plow and fenced in the wild grass. He was a frightened man. Tybo sensed, a man who looked at the horizon with worry rather than wonder. He lived there with his daughter. Tybo had seen her from a distance, a silhouette hanging laundry or carrying water buckets. He knew little about them, other than that they kept to themselves and that the local law, Deputy Crow, often rode out that way. That distant light looked like an island of warmth in a sea of freezing death. Tybo pulled back from the window, his breath pluming in the chilly air of the cabin. He imagined the inside of the Mayfield house. He imagined a cast-iron stove roaring with heat, floors made of planed wood, cupboards full of flour and sugar. He imagined safety. He looked down at Connie. The boy's eyes were closed, his lashes dark against his waxy skin. He looked like a doll made of clay that had been left out in the rain. "I cannot go there," Tybo said, his voice hardening. He knew what they saw when they looked at him. They did not see a grieving father. They did not see a neighbor. They saw a Comanche. They saw a savage. They saw the enemy who had burned settlements and taken scalps in the wars that were barely cold in their memories. Even though Tybo had cut his hair shorter to blend in, even though he wore the woolen trousers and flannel shirt of a white laborer, his face was a map of his heritage. To knock on their door in the middle of the night would be to invite a shotgun blast, not charity. And yet, the baby was starving. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the cabin with the force of a stampeding buffalo. The door rattled violently in its frame, and soot puffed out from the fireplace. Connie jerked in his sleep and let out a thin, high-pitched mewl of distress. Tybo tucked the baby inside his own heavy coat, pressing the small body against his chest to share his heat. He needed wood. The fire was dying, and if the fire died, the cold would win. "Stay still. Little star?" he whispered. "I must feed the fire." He moved to the corner where the wood pile should have been. It was empty, save for a few damp chips of bark and dust. He cursed softly in Comanche. He had been so consumed with the baby's illness that he had forgotten to bring in the logs from the stack outside before night fell. He had to go out. He hesitated. He did not want to leave Connie alone, not even for a minute. But the cold was a predator that was already inside the room. He had no choice. He placed the baby gently back into the nest of furs on the floor, far from the door but close to the fading warmth of the hearth. He tucked the blankets in tightly, ensuring only the baby's nose and mouth were exposed. "I will be back before the wind can touch you," he promised. He grabbed his hat, a battered, wide-brimmed felt thing that had seen better decades, and jammed it onto his head. He lifted the heavy wooden bar from the door and pushed. The wind fought him immediately. It pushed back against the door with a physical weight, stinging his eyes with grit and ice crystals. Tybo shoved his shoulder against the wood and forced his way out, pulling the door shut behind him and latching it from the outside to keep it from blowing open. The cold hit him like a hammer. It was a wet, heavy cold that soaked through his coat instantly. The Texas Panhandle was a cruel place in winter. There were no trees to break the wind, nothing to stop the gales that swept down from the Rockies and gathered speed across the plains until they hit the Red River Valley with murderous intent. Tybo bowed his head and trudged toward the woodpile near the lean-to stable. The mud sucked at his boots, threatening to pull them off his feet with every step. The lean-to was a simple structure, 3 walls and a thatched roof, where his horses huddled. He could hear them moving in the dark. He had 3 horses left. One was a sturdy pack mule, old and cantankerous. The other was a roan mare, sure-footed and gentle. And then there was the stallion. As Tybo grabbed an armful of split logs, the stallion nickered low in his throat. Tybo paused. He walked over to the rail, the wood rough against his gloved hand. The stallion, a paint with eyes that showed the white, pushed his nose against Tybo's shoulder. This horse was the last link to his old life. He had trained it himself, whispering into its ear until man and beast moved as one thought. They had hunted together. They had raced the wind. Now, the stallion stood in hock-deep mud, his coat matted, his ribs showing through his winter coat. "I know, brother," Tybo said, stroking the velvet nose. "I know you hate the fence. I hate it too." The horse nudged him again, harder this time, as if asking a question. "Why are we here? Why do we not run? I cannot run." Tybo answered the silent question. "He is too small. The wind would take his breath away if we rode." That was the trap. To stay was to starve slowly, to be ground down by the isolation and the prejudice of the settlers. To run was to kill his son. Tybo was a nomad whose feet were nailed to the floorboards of a rotting cabin. He turned back to the woodpile, his heart heavy. He gathered as many logs as he could carry, the bark digging into his forearms. The physical pain was grounding. It was real. It was better than the helplessness of watching the baby fade. He turned back toward the cabin. The wind whipped his hair into his eyes. He looked again toward the horizon, toward the Mayfield place. The light was still there, steady and mocking. Why did they have light? Why did their children live while his wife lay in the frozen earth and his son withered? He pushed the thought away. Envy was a poison. It would not fill the baby's belly. He reached the cabin door, fumbling with the latch with his numb fingers. He kicked the door open and stumbled inside, dropping the wood with a clatter near the hearth. He immediately went to the bundle on the floor. Connie was quiet, too quiet. Tybo fell to his knees, ripping the gloves from his hands. He touched the baby's cheek. It was cool. "No," Tybo breathed. "No, no, no." He frantically unwrapped the blankets. He put his ear to the baby's chest. For a second, he heard nothing but the roaring of the blood in his own ears and the wind outside. Then, faintly, he heard it. A heartbeat, fluttering, erratic, like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. But it was there. Tybo scooped the baby up, holding him skin to skin against his own chest, trying to transfer his own life force into the child. He sat by the dying embers and began to feed the fire, one log at a time, building it up until the flames licked the soot-stained stones. The heat rose, flushing Tybo's face, but the ice in his stomach did not melt. The baby was not eating. The rice water was not enough. The goat milk was poison to him. He needed what Tybo could not give. He needed a mother. He needed breast milk. Tybo looked at the empty pot where he had boiled the rice. He looked at the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, useless dried weeds. He looked at his own hands, strong enough to break a neck, useless to save a life. He realized then that he had reached the end of his skills. He had tried the Comanche ways, he had tried the settler ways, he had tried stubbornness, and he had tried prayer. None of it had worked. Connie let out a sound that was barely a cry. It was more like a sigh of exhaustion. The boy was fading. If he did not eat properly within 24 hours, Tybo knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had seen much death, that the boy would not see another sunrise. The realization broke something inside him. It broke the pride that had kept him from going into town. It broke the fear of the white man's law. He needed help. He thought of the town, 10 miles away. There was a doctor there. A man who charged $2 just to look at a sick horse. Would he look at a Comanche baby? And there were women in the town. Women with babies. Women with milk. But to go there was to beg. To go there was to walk into the lion's den. Deputy Silas Crow would be there. Crow, who had told Tybo when he first built this cabin, "You stay on your side of the creek. Chief, we don't want your kind mixing with decent folk." Tybo tightened his grip on his son. He would walk into hell if it meant finding milk. He would trade his horses. He would trade his land. He would trade his life. He looked once more toward the wall that faced the Mayfield homestead. The light would be gone now. Surely it was deep in the night, but the image of it burned in his mind. Gia family. Tybo whispered. Family. It was a word that used to mean the band, the tribe, the circle of teepees around the fire. Now, family was just this, a dying fire, a terrified man, and a dying child. He stood up, the decision crystallizing in his mind like ice on a trough. He would not wait for the morning sun to fully rise. As soon as the gray light of dawn touched the sky, he would ride. He would ride to the settlement. He would endure their stares and their spit. He would find someone, anyone, who had mercy in their veins instead of hate. He walked to the corner and retrieved a small pouch of cornmeal, his own food. He would mix a paste. He would try one last time to get the boy to swallow something, anything, to hold him until morning. As he worked, the wind outside changed its pitch. It stopped screaming and began to moan, a low, mournful sound that vibrated through the floorboards. It sounded like a grieving woman. Tybo shivered, not from the cold, but from the omen. "Hold on, little star," he said, his voice cracking. "Hold on. I will find you milk. I swear it on the bones of my ancestors. I will find you milk." He sat back down before the fire, feeding the boy drop by drop, watching the flames dance, waiting for the dawn that felt a lifetime away. The cabin felt smaller than ever, a wooden fist squeezing the life out of them. But in that squeeze, in that crushing pressure of survival, Tybo found a core of steel he thought he had lost. He was no longer a warrior of the plains. He was a father, and that was a more dangerous thing to be. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, rising to meet the wind. Tybo watched them go, prayers made of fire, disappearing into the cold. Indifferent night. The next day would bring salvation, or it would bring the end. There would be no middle ground. The wind whispered it. The cold promised it. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the rough logs, and waited for the light. Dawn did not bring hope. It brought a gray, suffocating light that revealed the full extent of the horror. Connie had stopped crying. The jagged, tearing wails that had kept Tybo awake for 3 nights had dissolved into something far worse, a shallow, rhythmic gasping. It was the sound of a small flame guttering out because there was no oil left to feed it. Tybo sat frozen, his hand hovering over the infant's chest. He could feel the heat radiating from the small body, a dry, consuming fever that seemed to be drinking the moisture right out of the child's skin. The baby's lips were parched, peeling back from gums that were too pale. When Tybo tried to drip water from a rag into the open mouth, the liquid just pooled there, unswallowed, before trickling down the side of the small neck. The boy had refused the breast of the goat. He had refused the rice water. Now, he was refusing to fight. Tybo stood up, the movement abrupt and violent. He kicked the empty water bucket, sending it clattering against the wall. The noise was loud, shocking in the small space. But Connie did not even flinch. That lack of reaction hit Tybo harder than a whip across the back. He had to move. If he stayed in this cabin for another hour, he would be wrapping a corpse in buckskin before the sun hit its zenith. He bundled the child. He took the softest furs, the ones he had cured himself with painstaking care, and wrapped Connie until he was nothing but a cocoon of warmth. He strapped the bundle to his chest, securing it with leather thongs so that the baby's head rested just under his chin. He could feel the faint, bird-like flutter of the heart against his own sternum. Outside, the wind had died down to a sullen breeze, but the air remained sharp enough to cut glass. Tybo saddled the roan mare. The stallion was faster, but the mare was smoother. She walked as if the ground were made of eggs. And today, Tybo could not afford a single jar or stumble. He rode toward the settlement. He did not look back at his cabin. He rode with his eyes fixed on the muddy track ahead, his mind a singular, screaming prayer. Live. Just live until I get there. The settlement was a collection of buildings that looked as if they had been dropped from the sky into the mud. There was a general store, a blacksmith whose hammer rang out like a bell, a saloon that smelled of stale beer even at this early hour, and a few scattered houses. Tybo kept his head down, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. But it did not matter. He was a Comanche in a white man's town. He carried his identity like a flag. As he rode down the main street, conversation stopped. A woman shaking a rug on a porch paused, the dust settling around her like a cloud, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. Two men loading barrels onto a wagon straightened up, their hands drifting instinctively toward their belts. Tybo pulled the mare to a halt in front of the mercantile. He knew the shopkeeper's wife had birthed a child 2 months ago. He had seen her sitting on the bench outside when he had come to trade skins for flour. He slid from the horse, his movements stiff. He walked to the door, the baby against his chest. He opened it, and the bell chimed a cheerful, welcoming sound that felt like a lie. The interior smelled of coffee beans and vinegar. Mrs. Gable was behind the counter, counting tins of tobacco. She looked up, a smile beginning to form, only to freeze and shatter the moment she saw who stood in her doorway. "We have no trade today," she said, her voice sharp. "My husband is out at the depot." "I do not need trade," Tybo said. His English was functional, stripped of elegance, learned from trappers and soldiers. "I need help. My son." He pulled the blanket back slightly to show the face of the infant. "He does not eat. He needs milk. Woman's milk." "Mrs." Gable recoiled as if he had presented her with a rattlesnake. She took a step back, her hand going to her throat. "Get that out of here." "Please," Tybo said. He did not beg often. The word tasted like ash. "He dies. You have milk. I will pay. I have skins. I have a horse." "I said get out!" Her voice rose to a shriek, fueled by a fear that had been fed to her by newspapers and rumors. "We don't want your sickness here. We don't nurse those." She did not say the word, but it hung in the air. "Savages." The back door of the shop opened, and a customer or perhaps a clerk stepped out, holding a broom handle like a club. "You heard the lady. Chief, move along." Tybo looked at them. He saw no pity. He saw only a wall of terrified hatred. He covered Connie's face again. His hand trembled, not with fear, but with the effort it took not to draw the knife at his belt. He turned and walked out, the bell chiming its cheerful farewell behind him. He went to the doctor's house next. It was a white clapboard structure with a neat fence. He knocked. The door opened 3 inches. A pair of spectacles caught the light. "Doctor," Tybo said, "my baby. I am busy." The voice came from behind the chain. "He dies," Tybo said again, slamming his hand against the wood to stop the door from closing. "He needs food. He cannot swallow." The doctor peered through the crack. He saw the dark braid over Tybo's shoulder. He saw desperation. "I treat Christians," the doctor said, his voice flat and clinical. "Take him to your medicine man. Don't bring the pox into my house." The door slammed shut. The bolt slid home. Tybo stood on the porch, the rejection washing over him like freezing rain. He looked at the sky. It was indifferent. He looked at the town. It was a fortress of closed doors. He walked back to his horse. He was checking the cinch, his fingers numb, when a shadow fell over him. "You look like a man who has lost his way." Tybo stiffened. He knew the voice. It was smooth, heavy, like oil sliding over stone. He turned to face Deputy Silas Crow. Crow was a big man, broad in the shoulders, wearing a tin star that was polished until it shone. He had a face that might have been handsome if not for the eyes that calculated the value of everything they touched. He chewed on a toothpick, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Deputy," Tybo acknowledged. Folks are getting jittery, Crow said, spitting a splinter of wood into the mud near Tybo's boot. Don't like seeing a redbird wandering around town with a bundle. Makes them think you stole something. I stole nothing. I seek help for my son. Crow stepped closer. He smelled of bay rum and old sweat. He leaned in, peering at the bundle on Tybo's chest. Is that right the little half-breed is sick? Tybo's jaw tightened. He needs milk. Crow clicked his tongue. That is a hard commodity to come by. Especially for you. People here, they have long memories. Tybo, they remember the raids. They don't care that you signed a paper and cut your hair. Do you have a heart, Crow? Tybo asked, his voice low, or just a badge. Crow laughed, a dry, barking sound. I have laws, and the law says vagrants and potential hostiles can be removed if they disturb the peace. And you, asking decent women for their breasts, that is disturbing the peace? Crow walked around the roan mare, inspecting her. Then he looked toward the edge of town, toward the open land where Tybo's cabin stood. But I am a charitable man. I could perhaps persuade someone. Maybe finding a wet nurse isn't impossible. Money talks, right? I have no money, Tybo said. No, Crow agreed. But you have land. That creek bottom you squat on. Good water there. And you have that paint stallion I see in your pen. Tybo understood. It was not an offer of help. It was a robbery. Crow was a vulture circling a dying animal. You want my land for milk? Tybo asked, disbelief warring with rage. I am saying that if you were to move along, go back to the reservation in Oklahoma, maybe, and leave the deed and the horse. I could ensure the boy gets fed before you go. A fair trade. Civilization has a price. Tybo looked at the deputy. He saw the greed naked in the man's eyes. If he gave the land, he would have nothing. If he gave the horse, he would have no way to work. And he knew, with sudden clarity, that Crow would take everything and likely let the baby die anyway. A man who bargained with the life of an infant had no honor to keep a deal. No, Tybo said. Crow's smile vanished. His face hardened into a mask of menace. Then you best get riding, Tybo, before I decide that you are trespassing. And if that baby dies, well, I will have to write it up as neglect. Might have to arrest you for that. Tybo mounted the mare. He did not say another word. He turned the horse and kicked her into a gallop, fleeing the town as if the devil himself were snapping at the mare's heels. He fled not from fear of the man, but from the fear of what he, Tybo, would do if he stayed. He would kill Crow. He would tear his throat out. And then Connie would truly be alone. The ride back was a blur of gray sky and brown earth. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of coming snow. By the time Tybo reached the cabin, the mare was blowing hard, foam flecking her chest. He brought Connie inside. The cabin was cold. The fire had burned down to embers. Tybo rushed to feed the flames, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He unwrapped the boy. Connie was still breathing, but the breaths were terrifyingly spaced out. Gasp! Silence! Silence! Gasp! Tybo felt a scream building in his throat, a primal roar of grief and impotence. He swallowed it down. He could not give up. He could not. He paced the room, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. He needed a signal. He needed to cast a net wider than his own pride. He went to the pile of cured hides in the corner. He found a piece of buckskin, light-colored and stiff. He took a piece of charcoal from the hearth. His hand hovered over the skin. He was a warrior. He was a provider. To do this was to admit total defeat. It was to lay his belly bare to the sky and beg for mercy. For him, the voice in his head whispered. For the promise you made to her. He pressed the charcoal to the skin. He wrote in blocky, uneven letters, the English he had learned to read from the treaty papers. Milk needed. Child dying. Please. He stared at the word, please. It looked like a wound on the leather. He grabbed a hammer and a nail. He went outside. The wind tried to snatch the sign from his hand, but he held it fast. He nailed it to the heavy log post of his gate, facing the road that hardly anyone traveled. the road that led only to the empty horizon and the distant Mayfield homestead. It was a beacon of despair. He went back inside and barred the door. He sat by the fire, holding his son, and waited for the end. Hours passed. The day bled away into a bruised purple twilight, and then into the pitch black of night. The temperature plummeted. Sleet began to tick against the roof, sounding like claws scratching for entry. Connie's breathing grew quieter. Tybo sang to him, old songs about the buffalo and the stars, songs that were supposed to guide a warrior home. Now, he feared they were guiding his son to the spirit world. He dozed, his chin resting on his chest, exhausted beyond measure. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was dull, heavy, barely audible over the wind. Tybo's head snapped up. Had he dreamed it? Thump, thump. Someone was at the door. Adrenaline flooded his veins. Crow. It had to be Crow. Come to finish the job. Come to drag him out into the snow or burn the cabin down. Tybo laid Connie gently in the cradleboard. He reached for the Winchester rifle leaning against the wall. He levered around into the chamber. The mechanical clack-clack loud in the silence. He moved to the door, pressing his back against the wall beside it. "Go away," he called out, his voice rough. "I have nothing for you." "The sign," a voice replied. It was high, strained, barely carrying through the thick wood. "The sign, it said the child is dying." It was a woman. Tybo lowered the barrel of the rifle slightly. He frowned. A trick. A trap. Crow was cunning enough to use a woman to get the door open. "Who are you?" Tybo demanded. "Open the door," the voice pleaded. "Please, I am freezing." There was something in the tone, not a threat, but a jagged edge of pain that matched his own. Tybo hesitated, his hand on the bar. If he opened it, he invited death. If he did not, death was already in the room with the baby. He lifted the bar. He opened the door 6 inches, the rifle ready. The wind pushed the door inward, bringing a swirl of sleet and ice. Standing on the threshold was a ghost. It was the girl from the homestead, Clara May. She was soaked to the bone. Her dark cloak was heavy with water, clinging to her small frame. Her bonnet had blown back, leaving her hair plastered to her skull in wet strands. Her face was stark white, her lips blue with cold. She stood there shivering so violently that her teeth chattered audibly. She did not look at the gun. She looked past Tybo, into the gloom of the cabin. "The baby," she stammered. Is he still—" Tybo stared at her. "He lives, barely. I have milk," she said. The words hung between them, simple and impossible. Tybo looked at her. She was alone. There was no horse behind her. She must have walked the 3 miles in the dark, in the sleet. He looked at her stomach, her waist. She was thin. There was no bundle in her arms. There was no child. Suspicion coiled in his gut like a snake. "You have no child," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Where is your baby?" Clara flinched as if he had struck her. Her hands came up to wrap around her midsection, hugging herself tightly. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, and a fresh tear tracked through the rain on her cheek. "Gone," she whispered. The word broke in the middle. 3 weeks. The fever." She opened her eyes, and Tybo saw it then. He saw the hollow, haunted look of a parent who had buried a piece of themselves. He knew that look because he saw it in the mirror every morning. "My body," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of cold and shame. "It doesn't know he is gone. It still makes the milk. It hurts. God, it hurts." She took a ragged breath. "I saw your sign. I saw it this afternoon when I went to the creek." She took a step forward, right up to the muzzle of the rifle. She did not seem to care if he pulled the trigger. "You need milk. I need to give it. Please." "Don't make me go back with it inside me. I can't bear it." It was madness. It was a tragedy so deep it felt like a sin. A white woman, the daughter of a settler who hated him, standing in his doorway, offering the lifeblood of her lost child to save him. Tybo looked at her, this enemy, this stranger. He saw the trap of society. If he let her in, if anyone found out, They would hang him. They would say he forced her. They would say he bewitched her. Crow would have all the excuses he needed. But then, from the cradle board near the fire, came the sound, gasp. A long, terrifying pause. Gasp. The decision was not made by his mind, but by his blood. Tybo lowered the rifle. He stepped back and pulled the door wide. "Come," he said. Clara stumbled over the threshold, bringing the smell of rain and wet wool into the dry heat of the room. Tybo slammed the door shut against the night and barred it instantly. He turned to see her standing by the fire, water dripping from her cloak onto the dirt floor. She was looking at the cradle board with a hunger that was terrifying to behold. "Warm yourself first," Tybo said, though he wanted to scream at her to hurry. "You are ice. You will chill him." "No," she said, her fingers fumbling with the wet strings of her cloak. She threw the heavy garment aside. Underneath, she wore a simple calico dress, stained with rain. Her hands went to the buttons of her bodice. Her fingers were stiff and cold, clumsy. "Give him to me," she commanded. It was not a request. Tybo moved to the cradle board. He lifted Connie. The baby was limp, a dead weight. Tybo felt a spike of terror. Was he too late? He carried the boy to Clara. She sat on the low stool by the fire. She did not look at Tybo. Her eyes were locked on the child. She opened her dress, freeing a breast that was swollen and hard. The veins blew against the pale skin. Tybo lowered his son into her arms. The contact was immediate. Clara gasped. A sound of pain and relief intermingled. She adjusted the baby, her hand cupping his small head with a familiarity that made Tybo's heart ache. She brushed the nipple against the baby's mouth. "Come on," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Come on, little one, take it." For a moment, Connie did not move. He lay there, too weak to root. Tybo held his breath, the silence of the room stretching until it screamed. Then, instinct flickered. Connie's mouth opened slightly. He latched. It was weak at first, a tentative pull. Then, as the warm, sweet milk hit his tongue, the survival instinct roared to life. He sucked harder. He gulped. Clara threw her head back, closing her eyes, her face twisted in a rictus of grief. She was feeding a ghost. She was holding a stranger's child and feeling the relief of her own body's purpose. And every swallow Connie took was a reminder of the son she had buried. Tybo turned away. He could not watch. It was too intimate, too raw. It was a holy thing, and it was a broken thing. He walked to the window and stared at the shutters, his back to them, behind him. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic, wet sound of a baby nursing, drinking life from the sorrow of a woman who had crossed the line of war to save him. The night outside was dark, and the wind was cruel. But in the cabin, the gasping had stopped. The breathing had begun. The only sound in the cabin was the rhythm of swallowing, a wet, frantic sound that filled the small space like a thunderclap. Tybo stood with his back to the hearth, his face turned toward the shadowed corner where he kept his tack. He could not look. To look felt like a violation of a sacred rite, and a violation of the woman who sat on his milking stool, her dress unbuttoned, giving life to his son. His hands gripped the rough wood of the saddle rack until his knuckles turned the color of old bone. He was a warrior who had ridden through arrow storms and blizzards without flinching. But this sound, the sound of his son drinking, living, broke him. Hot. Silent tears tracked through the dust on his cheeks. They dripped from his chin onto his flannel shirt, unheeded. The knot of terror that had lived in his chest for 3 days began to unravel, leaving him weak and trembling. Behind him, the rhythm slowed. A soft exhale, long and shuddering, escaped Clara May. "He was starving," she said. Her voice was no longer the high, desperate keen of the woman standing in the sleet. It was lower, filled with a husky, exhausted tenderness. "He has taken the first side. He is resting." Tybo wiped his face with his sleeve before turning. He kept his eyes low, respectful. Clara sat illuminated by the firelight, her wet hair steaming slightly in the warmth. She had pulled the edge of her shawl up to cover her breast and the baby's face, creating a small, private tent of wool. Her head was bowed over the child, her cheek resting against the top of the cradle board. "You saved him," Tybo said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "I had no way." Clara did not look up. Her finger traced the rim of the cradle board. "Do not thank me. Not yet. The milk was... It was a pain. A weight." She looked up then, and Tybo saw the raw, red rim of her eyes. My son would have been his size. Just his size. The grief in the room was a third presence, standing tall between them. Tybo nodded once. He understood that she had not done this for him, or even for the baby's name. She had done it to silence the ghosts in her own body. "The storm is bad," Tybo said, shifting to the practical matters of survival. It was the only way he knew how to navigate the intimacy of the moment. "You cannot go back tonight. The creek will be up. The mud will take a horse down." Clara looked at the door, where the wind was still battering against the wood. She looked back at the baby, who had begun to root again, making small, demanding noises. "I cannot leave him," she whispered. "He needs to feed again in 2 hours, and again 2 hours after that. If I leave, the hunger comes back." "Then you stay," Tybo said firmly. "I will make a place." He moved with a sudden, purposeful energy. He needed to work. He needed to burn off the emotion before it drowned him. He went to the corner where he kept his cured hides. He selected 2 large buffalo robes, thick and heavy with winter fur. He strung a rawhide line across the back third of the cabin, partitioning off the sleeping platform from the main room. He draped a heavy trade blanket over the line, creating a wall of fabric. "For you," he said, gesturing to the space behind the blanket. "It is warm there. The draft does not reach it." Clara watched him, her eyes heavy with fatigue. She nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Tybo." For the next 3 days, the cabin became a world unto itself, suspended in the gray amber of the winter storm. The routine was dictated by the infant. Every few hours, Connie would wake, and Clara would lift him from the cradle board. Tybo would immediately busy himself with tasks mending a bridle, sharpening his knife, stoking the fire, anything to give her the illusion of solitude in the single room. Tybo found himself observing her when she was not looking. She was not a beauty in the way the town women were, with their pinched waists and fancy hats. She was solid, made of earth and work. Her hands were red from lye soap and cold water, her fingernails short, but when she held his son, there was a grace to her that made his throat tight. He began to serve her in the only language he spoke fluently: action. He noticed the draft coming from the north window, the one that made Clara pull her shawl tighter in the evenings, while she slept during the afternoon of the second day. Tybo went outside into the biting wind. He mixed mud and dry grass into a thick daub and packed the cracks around the window frame, sealing it tight. He cut a piece of oilskin and nailed it over the shutters on the outside for double protection. When Clara woke for the evening feeding, she paused. "The air," she said, looking at the window. "It is still." "The wind has no business here," Tybo said simply. Stirring a pot of venison stew over the fire, he cooked for her. He had shot a deer 2 weeks prior, and the meat was smoking in the shed. He cut the best portions, the tenderloin, and simmered them with wild onions and dried turnips until the broth was rich and dark. He served her in his only tin bowl, wiping it clean with a cloth first. "Eat," he commanded gently. "You make milk, you must have meat." Clara took the bowl. Their fingers brushed as the tin passed between them. The contact was brief, a spark of static in the dry heat of the cabin. But Tybo felt it travel up his arm like a lightning strike. He pulled his hand back, perhaps too quickly. Clara looked down at the stew, a flush rising on her neck that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a slow-burning tension, born of proximity and shared purpose. They moved around each other in the small space like 2 planets forced into a new, tight orbit. There was the scent of her milk, rain-dried wool, and the lavender soap she must have used days ago mixing with the wood smoke and leather of his home. It was intoxicating and terrifying. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The sun emerged, weak and watery, glinting off the drifts of slush. Around noon, a mule plodded through the mud toward the cabin. Tybo watched from the door, his Winchester resting easily in the crook of his arm. He recognized the rider. It was Hetty, the midwife who lived on the edge of the black settlement, a woman who knew the secrets of every family within 20 miles. Hetty climbed down, her knees creaking audibly. She carried a woven basket. She looked at Tybo with sharp, bird-like eyes. "Put the gun down, horseman," she snapped, though her tone was not unkind. "I am here for the baby, not your scalp." Tybo stepped aside. Hetty bustled in, bringing a gust of cold air. She stopped when she saw Clara sitting by the fire, burping Connie over her shoulder. "Well," Hetty said, her hands on her hips, "the rumors run fast, but the truth is usually sitting by the fire. I heard you were missing. Clara May." Clara looked up, defiance warring with shame in her eyes. "I am not missing. Hetty, I am right where I am needed." Hetty moved to the stool, checking the baby with efficient, practiced hands. She pressed his stomach, checked his gums, and looked at the color of his skin. "He is filling out," Hetty pronounced. "Another week and he will have cheeks again." She turned her attention to Clara. She reached into her basket and pulled out a jar of salve and a bundle of dried leaves. "Sage tea for your nerves, girl. And this salve is for the soreness. You are feeding a glutton, by the looks of him." She handed the items to Clara, then turned to Tybo. The humor dropped from her face. "You have a problem." "Tybo," she said, her voice low. "I have many problems." Tybo replied, "This one wears a badge." Hetty said, "Crow was at the general store yesterday. He was talking loudly, saying how it is a sin against nature for a white woman to be kept by a Comanche buck. He is using words like kidnapping and defilement." Clara gasped. "I came here. No one kidnapped me." "Truth does not matter to a man like Crow when he wants something," Hetty said grimly. "He wants your daddy's water rights, Clara, and he wants Tybo's land and horses. He is stirring the pot. He is telling folks that Tybo surely bewitched you with pagan medicine." Tybo felt a cold rage settle in his stomach. It was the old enemy, the one that did not fight with lances but with words and papers. "And your father," Hetty continued, looking at Clara. "Abel is scared. Crow is leaning on him, telling him his reputation is ruined unless he rescues you. Expect company. Tybo, and not the friendly kind." Hetty left an hour later, leaving a silence in the cabin that was heavier than before. That evening, the tension in the room shifted. It was no longer just the awkwardness of strangers. It was the shared weight of a siege. Tybo sat on the floor, oiling a bridle. Clara sat in the chair, rocking the baby. The fire had died down to glowing coals. "You should go," Tybo said, not looking up. "When the mud freezes tomorrow morning, you should go back. Tell them you were lost in the storm. Tell them I found you and brought you back. Blame me. It is safer." "And the baby?" Clara asked. "He is stronger. I will find a goat, a better goat." "He will die," Clara said. Her voice was flat, certain. "He will reject the goat, and he will die. If you stay, they will destroy your name," Tybo said. He looked at her then, his dark eyes intense. "A woman's name is her life out here. Without it, you are nothing to them." Clara stood up. She walked over to where Tybo sat. She still held the sleeping infant against her shoulder. The firelight caught the curve of her jaw, the determination in her set mouth. "Do you think I care about them?" she asked. "After my baby died, the women in town, they came, they brought casseroles. They said, 'It is God's will.' They said, 'You are young. You will have another.' So they looked at me like I was a broken pot that just needed to be thrown out and replaced." She shivered. And Tybo instinctively reached for the buffalo robe he had been sitting on. He stood and draped it over her shoulders. His hands lingered for a second on the thick fur, close to her neck. She did not pull away. She leaned into the warmth, leaned almost imperceptibly toward him. They were close now. Tybo could smell the milk in the sage salve Hetty had brought. He could hear the catch in her breath. "I did not come here for you. Tybo, she said, looking up into his face. Her eyes were dry and clear. I did not come for your land, or because I pity the lonely Comanche. I came because I heard a cry in the wind that sounded like my son. And when I hold him, she tightened her grip on the blanket. When I hold him, the screaming in my head stops. That is all. That is enough, Tybo whispered. He wanted to touch her face. The impulse was so strong it frightened him. He wanted to brush the stray lock of hair from her forehead. Instead, he stepped back, retreating into the shadow. Sleep, he said. I will watch the door. The next day brought a different kind of visitor. Tybo was chopping wood near the stable when he heard the hoofbeats. He did not reach for his rifle. He knew the rhythm of these hooves. It was an unshod pony. Nokoni rode out of the scrub brush. He was a cousin of Tybo's, a man who had refused to cut his hair, who wore the white man's clothes with a disdainful sloppiness. He stopped his pony 10 feet from Tybo and sat there, looking at the cabin, then at the smoke rising from the chimney. The fire burns hot, Nokoni said in Comanche. It keeps the cold out. Tybo replied in the same tongue. I hear it keeps a white woman warm, too. Nokoni said. His face was hard, his eyes scanning the perimeter. They talk in the camps. They say Tybo has forgotten who killed his wife. They say he sleeps with the enemy. She nurses my son, Tybo said, his voice cold. That is all. Without her, Connie dies. Would the people prefer a dead Comanche baby to a live one fed by white milk? Nokoni spat on the ground. She is a trap, brother. You do not see it, that lawman. Crow. He waits. He waits for you to get comfortable. Then he will say you stole her. He will bring the soldiers. And they will not just kill you. They will burn us all out. They look for a reason. Tybo drove the axe into the chopping block with a violent thud. I will not let my son starve for fear of what might happen. Then you are a fool, Nokoni said. He turned his pony. When the wolves come, do not expect the pack to run with you. You have chosen your side. Nokoni kicked his horse and galloped away, disappearing into the brown landscape. Tybo stood alone with the axe. He looked at the vast, empty horizon. He felt the walls closing in. From the town, Crow was weaving a net of laws and lies. From the plains, his own people were turning their backs. He walked back to the cabin. He opened the door. Clara was there, humming a low, tuneless melody as she rocked the baby. The sight of it, the peace of it, punched the air from his lungs. He knew then that Nokoni was right. The wolves were coming. And for the first time in his life, Tybo had something he was terrified to lose. He barred the door from the inside, a heavy piece of oak dropping into place. It felt flimsy. It felt like nothing against the storm that was gathering, not of wind and snow this time, but of hate and greed. He went to the hearth and sat opposite her. He began to clean his Winchester, oiling the mechanism until it slid silent and smooth. Clara watched him. She did not ask why. She just pulled the buffalo robe tighter around the baby and kept humming, her voice a fragile shield against the world outside. The island of warmth was still burning, but the ocean around them was rising fast. The poison of the town did not travel by road. It traveled on the wind. Lighter than chaff and sharper than a skinning knife. The rumors had started as whispers in the pews of the church and the back rooms of the saloon. But within 2 days, they had become a roar that deafened the conscience of the settlement. They said Clara May Mayfield had lost her mind with grief. They said she had been bewitched by pagan spells. They said she was selling her body to a savage for horse meat. They said the Comanche had kidnapped her to raise a new generation of warriors to burn their homes. The truth that a woman was simply feeding a starving child was too simple and too pure for minds twisted by fear and prejudice. It was rejected in favor of a story that justified their hatred. The first wave of this violence arrived not with a gun, but with a father. Tybo was mucking out the stall of the roan mare when he heard the wagon. It was a rickety buckboard, its wheels groaning in the ruts. He stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag, his face impassive. He saw Abel Mayfield, a man stooped by years of fighting the hard Texas soil, climbing down from the seat. Abel held a shotgun, but he held it loosely, the barrel pointing at the mud. His knuckles white, not with aggression, but with terror. Tybo did not reach for his own weapon. He simply stood between the wagon and the cabin door. A silent gatekeeper. "Clara," Abel shouted, his voice cracking. "Clara May, you come out here right now." The cabin door opened. Clara stepped onto the small porch. She looked different from the ghost who had arrived in the rain. Her spine was straight. She wore her dress with a new dignity, though it was wrinkled. She held Connie in her arms, wrapped in the buffalo robe Tybo had given her. "I am here, Papa," she said. Abel stared at her, his eyes darting from her face to the dark bundle in her arms, and then to Tybo. He looked sick. "Get in the wagon," Abel hissed. "Good Lord, girl, do you know what they are saying? Do you know what shame you have brought on my house? Reverend Miller wouldn't even look at me this morning when I went to buy seed." "I am feeding a child, Papa," Clara said calmly. "Since when is mercy a shame?" "Mercy," Abel stepped forward, his face flushing red. "This isn't mercy. This is unnatural. You are in a bachelor buck's cabin, playing house with one of them. Crow is talking about seizing the deed. Clara, he says I can't control my own family. He says I'm unfit. He's going to take the farm." Clara descended the single step, walking until she was toe-to-toe with her father. Tybo tensed, ready to intervene, but Clara's voice stopped him. It was cold steel. "You are afraid of the land," she said. "You are afraid of Crow. You are afraid of the neighbors." "I am afraid for your soul," Abel shouted, though the lie was thin in his voice. "No," Clara cut him off. "You are afraid of people. You are more afraid of what they say in the saloon than you were afraid of me dying of grief in that empty house. When my baby died, Papa, you told me to hush. You told me to stop crying because it made the men uncomfortable. Well, I am done hushing." She pulled the robe tighter around Connie. "I am saving a life. If that costs you your reputation, then the price is cheap. Go home, Papa. Tell Crow to come himself if he is so concerned." Abel stood there, his mouth opening and closing. He looked small against the vast gray sky. He looked at Tybo, a flicker of hatred in his eyes, the hatred of a weak man for a strong one. "He is coming," Abel spat, turning back to his wagon. "And he isn't bringing a Bible. He is bringing a rope." Abel whipped the mules and rattled away, leaving a silence that felt like the drop in pressure before a tornado. Tybo looked at Clara. She was trembling now, the adrenaline fading. "He is right about one thing," Tybo said. "Crow will come." "Let him come," Clara said, turning back to the door. But Tybo saw the fear she tried to hide. It was in the way she clutched the baby, as if she could shield him with her own ribs. Crow did not come alone, and he did not come quickly. He let the fear ripen for 2 days. When he finally appeared, the sky had turned a bruised purple, heavy with unseasonal snow. He rode with 4 men, the militia, a glorified name for the town's roughnecks and drunks who had been deputized with the promise of whiskey and action. They stopped at the fence line. Tybo stood on the porch, his Winchester in his hands. He did not aim it, but he held it across his chest, a clear line drawn in the air. Crow dismounted, his boots sinking into the slush. He walked with an arrogant swagger, his hand resting on his pistol. The other men fanned out, their eyes hungry for violence. "Step aside, Tybo," Crow called out. "Official business. We have reports of a woman being held against her will. And a child in danger." "She is free," Tybo said. "The child is fed. Leave us." "We need to see for ourselves," Crow said, stepping onto the porch. The wood creaked under his weight. He was close enough that Tybo could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "Unless you want to resist, I have 4 witnesses who will say you drew on a lawman." Tybo looked at the men. Their hands were twitching near their holsters. They wanted him to fight. They wanted an excuse to put a bullet in him and burn the cabin. If he fought, Connie would die in the crossfire. If he died, there would be no one to stand between the baby and the world. He made the choice of a father. not a warrior. He lowered the rifle and stepped aside. Crow smirked. A victory without a shot fired. He pushed the door open and strode inside. Clara was sitting by the fire. She stood up instantly, putting herself between Crow and the cradleboard. "Deputy," she said, her voice icy. "Miss Mayfield." Crow tipped his hat, a mocking gesture. "Your father is worried sick. He says you are confused, says the grief has turned your head." He walked past her, ignoring her protests, and looked into the cradleboard. Connie was sleeping, his small face flushed with warmth and milk. Crow reached out a gloved finger and poked the baby's cheek. Tybo's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every instinct screamed at him to break the man's arm, to drive his knife into the deputy's throat. But he held still. He stood like a statue carved from granite, breathing shallowly through his nose. "Scrawny thing," Crow muttered. "Hardly looks human, does he?" "He is a baby," Clara snapped. "Do not touch him." Crow turned to her. "You know, Clara, there are laws about raising children in unfit environments. A dirt floor cabin with a savage, that is no place for a Christian soul, even a half-breed one. The church has an orphanage in Abilene." "The nuns there, they know how to wash the heathen out of a boy." Clara went pale. "You wouldn't—" "If I determine the child is neglected," Crow said, looking directly at Tybo, "I have the authority to remove him. For his own good, of course." He walked a slow circle around the room, kicking at a pile of furs, looking at the dried meat hanging from the rafters with disgust. "I am giving you 24 hours. Tybo," Crow said, "to clear out, or to hand over the girl and the kid. You don't own this land, not really, and you certainly don't own a white woman. Tomorrow, I will come back with the judge's order, and maybe a few more boys." He stopped at the door and looked back. "Smart move, not shooting. Maybe you are domesticated after all." The militia laughed as they mounted up. They rode away, leaving the door hanging open to the biting wind. Tybo shut the door and barred it. The silence that followed was suffocating. The threat of the orphanage hung in the air like smoke. To Tybo, it was a death sentence. To take Connie away, to give him to strangers who hated his blood, it was worse than killing him. "They will take him," Clara whispered. She sank onto the stool, covering her mouth with her hand. "They will put him in a place without love. He will die there, Tybo, just like my baby died." "They will not take him," Tybo said. He went to the window. The snow had started to fall in earnest now, thick flakes that swirled frantically. "The storm comes. It buys us time. They cannot ride in a blizzard." But the storm was a double-edged sword. It kept the enemy out, but it trapped them in. As night fell, the wind rose to a shriek. The temperature plummeted. It was a whiteout, the world erased by a wall of driving snow. Suddenly, there was a scratching at the back wall of the cabin. Not the wind, something rhythmic. Tybo moved silently to the chinking he had loosened for ventilation. He peered out. A face appeared in the gap, hooded and snow-covered. It was Nokoni. "Open the shutter," Nokoni hissed. Tybo unlatched the small window. Nokoni did not come in. He stayed in the storm, a shadow in the white. "You have little time, cousin," Nokoni said. "I rode past the creek. Comancheros are camped in the ravine. They have been watching." "Comancheros!" Tybo felt a new chill. These were traders who dealt in human misery guns, whiskey, and captives. "They heard about the white woman," Nokoni said. "They do not care about laws or deputies. They know she is here. They plan to take her when the storm covers their tracks. A white woman is worth 50 horses in Mexico. And the baby, they will use the baby to make her quiet." "Why do you tell me this?" Tybo asked. "You said I was a fool." "You are a fool," Nokoni said. "But you are blood, and I do not want our enemies to have the satisfaction." Nokoni vanished into the swirl of snow before Tybo could answer. Tybo turned back to the room. Clara was standing there. She had heard. "Skin hunters," she said, her voice hollow. "Men who sell people." "We must keep watch," Tybo said. "The storm is bad. They may not come tonight." "They will come," Clara said. "Because of me. I am the prize. I brought this to your door. Tybo, the deputy wants your land because I am here. The hunters want to attack because I am here. The baby is in danger because I am here." "No," Tybo said firmly. "You are the life-bringer. Do not speak this way." He checked the fire. "Sleep. I will watch. No one enters this cabin while I breathe." He sat by the door, his rifle across his knees. The wind hammered against the logs, sounding like fists beating for entry. Tybo fought the exhaustion that pulled at his eyelids. He watched the flames dance, thinking of the orphanage, thinking of the Comancheros, thinking of the circle of wolves closing in. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, the exhaustion won. His head dipped, his breathing slowed. He drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of ice and empty cradles. He woke up with a start. The fire had burned down to red embers. The room was freezing. His instinct screamed before his mind registered the change. The silence. The wind was still howling outside, but the cabin felt empty. He looked at the bed behind the curtain. Empty. He looked at the cradleboard near the hearth. Gone. Tybo scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He saw the door. It was unbarred. A drift of snow had blown in across the threshold. "Clara!" he shouted. There was no answer. He saw something on the table, a scrap of paper, weighted down by a cartridge shell. He picked it up. In the dim light of the embers, he read the scrawl. "They want me. If I am gone, they will not burn your house. If I take him, they will not put him in the orphanage. I will go to the mission in San Angelo. I can keep him safe. Forgive me. It was madness. San Angelo was 50 miles away. In this storm, it might as well be on the moon." She had taken the baby to save Tybo from the violence she believed she attracted. She thought she could outrun the storm and the men who hunted her. Tybo grabbed his coat. He grabbed his knife and his rifle. He jammed his hat onto his head and tied it down with a scarf. He ran out into the night. The world was a blinding vortex of white. He could not see 5 feet in front of him. The cold was instant and brutal, freezing the moisture in his nose. He looked at the ground. The snow was drifting fast, covering everything, but there faint depressions in the new powder. Footsteps, small, struggling footsteps leading away from the cabin, not toward the town, but toward the river, toward the cover of the cottonwoods. She was trying to hide in the timber, trying to make her way south. Fear, cold and sharp as a lance, pierced Tybo's chest. She would not last 3 hours in this. The baby would freeze. The Comancheros were out there. The wolves were out there. He did not go back for a horse. The snow was too deep. A horse would break a leg in the hidden gopher holes. He had to run. He fell into the rhythm of the hunt. He bent low, shielding his eyes with his hand. He became the predator he had once been. But this time, he was hunting the only things in the world that mattered. He saw where she had stumbled, a depression in the snow where she had fallen and gotten back up. He saw a scrap of wool caught on a mesquite bush, blue wool from her shawl. "Hold on," he roared into the wind, though the sound was snatched away instantly. "Hold on, little star. I'm coming." He ran. He ran until his lungs burned like fire and his legs felt like lead. He ran against the wind, against the snow, against the fate that tried to take his family. The storm raged, trying to erase him. But Tybo was a son of the plains. He would not be erased, not tonight. He pushed forward into the white oblivion, a single dark shape moving against the fury of the winter, driven by a love that was fiercer than any blizzard. The chase was on, and the prize was life itself. The wind did not just blow, it possessed the landscape, turning the familiar contours of the creek bed into an alien geography of shifting white dunes. Tybo moved through it not by sight, for there was no sight in this blindness, but by the primal pull of his heart. He was a needle drawn to a magnet, and the magnet was the faint, fading heat of the 2 souls he had sworn to protect. He found them 2 miles from the cabin, sheltered in the lee of a collapsed limestone overhang that had once served as a winter break for buffalo. It was a shallow cave, barely deep enough to keep the snow from burying them alive. Clara May was curled into a ball, her back to the screaming wind. She was not moving. The blue wool of her shawl was frosted white, stiff as a board. "Clara!" Tybo roared, but the wind tore the name from his lips and scattered it into the void. He threw himself down beside her, his knees cracking against the frozen earth. He ripped his gloves off with his teeth and shoved his hands under the shawl, searching for warmth, searching for life. Her skin was like marble. She gasped when his hands touched her neck, a ragged, hitching sound that was more reflex than consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open. They were glazed, staring past him at a horizon she could no longer see. I can't," she stammered, her teeth chattering so violently the words were chopped into gibberish. "The milk, it's gone. The cold stopped it." Tybo looked down. Connie was pressed against her chest, buried deep in the layers of wet wool. The baby was silent. Not the silence of sleep, but the stillness that comes before the end. "No," Tybo growled. He stripped off his heavy buffalo coat. The cold hit him instantly, a physical blow that seized his lungs, but he did not hesitate. He draped the massive, heavy fur over Clara and the child, creating a tent of warmth. He crawled in with them, using his own body as a shield, pressing his chest against her back, wrapping his arms around both of them. "Breathe," he commanded, his mouth close to her ear. "You must heat him. You must heat yourself." Clara began to weep, dry, tearless sobs that shook her frame. "I am not his mother," she choked out. "Crow was right. I am just a ghost haunting a cradle. I stole him into the cold. I killed him." It was the breaking point, the steel spine that had held her upright against her father, and the town had snapped under the weight of the storm. She was just a girl, frozen and terrified, convinced that her love was a curse. Tybo tightened his grip. He could feel the slow, sluggish beat of her heart against his forearm. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rough and low, vibrating through her ribs. "You did not steal him. You saved him from the wolves in the town. You did not take him from me. Clara, you brought him back." He pressed his face into her frozen hair. "Blood makes a relative. Spirit makes a family. You are his spirit now. Do not fade." Under the heavy fur, in the shared heat of their bodies, something shifted. The warmth began to pool. Clara's shivering eased from a convulsion to a tremble, and then a small, miraculous sound. Connie whimpered. It was a weak sound, but in the roaring emptiness of the storm, it was a trumpet blast of victory. "He lives," Clara whispered. "He lives," Tybo confirmed. But the storm was not the only hunter on the plains that night. Through the howl of the wind, a new sound cut through the heavy, rhythmic crunch of horses pushing through deep snow. Tybo stiffened. He reached for his Winchester, which he had dragged under the furs with him. He pushed the buffalo robe aside just enough to see out. Shadows emerged from the white wall. They were shaped like men, but they moved like wraiths. Deputy Silas Crow sat atop a large bay horse that was chest-deep in a drift. He wore a heavy oilskin duster, and his hat was tied down with a scarf. Behind him were 3 of his militiamen, their faces wrapped in wool, their rifles drawn. They had followed the tracks before the wind could erase them. "End of the line! Tybo!" Crow shouted. His voice was thin, whipped away by the gale, but the malice remained. "You can't outrun the law, not even in hell." Crow leveled his pistol at the small shelter. "Come out, hand over the girl and the kid. We take them back. You can stay here and freeze. That's the deal. A life for a life." Tybo shifted his body, putting himself fully between the guns and Clara. He raised his rifle. "Go back, Crow!" Tybo yelled. "The storm will kill us all if you stay." "I won't leave without the girl," Crow screamed back. "She is the key to the land." But as Crow cocked the hammer of his revolver, another set of shadows materialized from the tree line to the east, flanking the shelter. These riders did not have heavy coats or oilskins. They wore buffalo hides and carried lances cut from ash wood. It was Noconi and 4 warriors from the band. They had been tracking the Comancheros, but the storm had turned them toward the smell of conflict. Now, Tybo was trapped in the center of a deadly triangle. Noconi rode his pony forward, ignoring the militia. He looked at Tybo, then at the white men. "The wolves are hungry!" Noconi shouted in Comanche, "Give us the woman, Tybo. We will trade her to the Mexicans. It will buy blankets for the winter. It is a good price for a white squaw." Tybo looked at his cousin. Noconi's face was hard, etched with the bitterness of a defeated people. He did not hate Tybo, but he loved the survival of the tribe more. To him, Clara was currency. To Crow, she was a deed to land. To Tybo, she was the mother of his son. "She is not for trade," Tybo shouted, switching between English and Comanche so both sides understood. "And she is not for taking. She belongs to no one but herself. She is white," Noconi spat. "She is the enemy. She is a savage," Crow yelled. "She has fallen." The two sides, the lawman and the warrior, were mirrors of each other, reflecting the same greed and hatred, just wearing different clothes, and in the middle, in the snow, was the only thing that mattered: a baby who needed milk. Tybo stood up. He let the buffalo robe fall from his shoulders, revealing his chest to the biting wind. He held his rifle in one hand, barrel pointed at the sky. "Look at you!" he roared, his voice cracking with fury. "You fight over a woman and a baby like dogs over a bone. You speak of law, you speak of honor. There is no honor here." On deadly cold, he pointed at the bundle behind him. "There is life here, a life that belongs to neither side. If you want them, you must kill me. And know this, I will not die alone." The wind surged, a blinding gust that forced the horses to turn their heads. In the confusion, Clara did the unthinkable. She threw off the remaining furs. She stood up. She was shaking, her lips blue, her dress wet and clinging to her legs. She held Connie against her breast, shielding him with her hands. She looked small, fragile, and utterly invincible. She walked past Tybo. She stepped out into the open, into the killing field between the guns and the lances. "Stop it!" she screamed. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind like a razor. She turned her eyes to Crow. "You want to save me, Silas. You want to bring me home to my father." Crow lowered his gun an inch, surprised. "I am doing my duty, Clara. You are sick. You are confused." "I am not confused," she cried, tears freezing on her cheeks. "My baby died. Silas. My son died in the dark because I was afraid to ask for help. And now, I have milk burning in my chest, and a baby is dying in my arms. And you want to take him to an orphanage so you can steal a creek bed." She ripped the top of her dress open further, exposing the pale skin of her chest to the blizzard, exposing the child who was frantically trying to nurse. "Look," she commanded. "Is this a sin? Is this a crime? Or is it just a hungry child?" She turned to Noconi. "And you want to sell me? I am the one keeping your brother's son alive, without me. The last of Tybo's line dies tonight. Is that the warrior's way, to kill the future for a blanket?" Silence fell over the clearing. The shame of it hung heavy in the air. The men looked at the woman, baring her breast in a blizzard to feed a child that wasn't hers. It was an act of such raw, primal defiance that it stripped away their politics and their greed. But Crow was a man who had built his life on power, not shame. The humiliation of being lectured by a hysterical woman in front of savages broke his restraint. "You are mad," Crow snarled. He raised his pistol again, aiming not at Tybo, but at Clara. "If you won't be saved, then be damned." "No!" Tybo lunged. At that exact second, the storm delivered its verdict. A massive limb from a dead cottonwood tree above the overhang, burdened by the weight of the ice, snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. It crashed down between Crow and Clara. The impact sent a plume of snow exploding outward. Crow's horse reared, terrified by the noise and the spray of ice. Crow fired. The bullet went wild, whining harmlessly into the sky. Tybo did not hesitate. He vaulted over the fallen limb. He was a blur of motion, fueled by adrenaline and rage. He hit Crow just as the deputy struggled to control his mount. Tybo dragged Crow from the saddle. They fell into the deep drift, a tangle of limbs and leather. Crow struck out with the pistol, catching Tybo on the cheekbone, splitting the skin. Blood, hot and red, sprayed onto the white snow. Tybo ignored the pain. He wrenched the gun from Crow's hand and tossed it away. He pinned the deputy to the ground, his forearm crushing against Crow's throat. Crow gasped, his eyes bulging. Tybo drew his knife. The blade glinted in the gray light. "Do it!" Nokoni shouted from his pony. "Cut his throat! Brother, let the blood warm the ground!" Tybo looked down at Crow. He saw the fear in the man's eyes. He saw the pathetic, small soul that lived behind the badge. He could kill him. It would be easy. It would be justice. Then he heard it. Through the wind, a soft, suckling sound. He looked up. Clara had fallen to her knees in the snow, but she had not dropped the baby. She was huddled over him, rocking back and forth, shielding him from the chaos. She was feeding him, even in the middle of violence. She was choosing life. Tybo looked back at Crow. If he killed him, he became the monster Crow said he was. If he killed him, the law would come with an army. Connie would grow up running. Tybo sheathed his knife. He leaned down, his face inches from Crow's. "This is not your land," Tybo hissed. "And she is not your property. If you ever come near my son again, the storm will be the least of your fears. I will find you, and I will not bring a knife." He grabbed Crow by the collar and threw him backward, into the slush. "Go!" Tybo roared. Crow scrambled backward, coughing, clutching his throat. He looked for his gun, but it was lost in the drift. He looked at his men. They were sitting on their horses, rifles lowered, staring at Clara with a mixture of awe and discomfort. They had no stomach for this anymore. They had seen a mother fight, and they had seen a father show mercy. The fight had gone out of them. Crow stumbled to his horse and mounted, his movements jerky and humiliated. He glared at Tybo, holding his bruised throat. "You think you won?" Crow rasped. "The winter isn't over, Comanche, and neither is the law." He spurred his horse and plowed back into the white curtain, his men following in silence. Tybo turned to the east. Nokoni was still there. The warrior looked at Tybo, then at Clara. He shook his head slowly. "You have a strange heart. Tybo," Nokoni said, "you let the wolf live. The wolf has no teeth left." Tybo said, "Go, cousin, before the snow traps you." Nokoni looked at Clara one last time. There was no longer calculation in his eyes, only a grudging respect. He raised his lance in a silent salute, turned his pony, and vanished into the storm. Tybo was alone again. He turned to Clara. She was still on her knees, shivering violently. The adrenaline was crashing, and the cold was rushing back in to claim her. He ran to her. He scooped her up, baby and all, into his arms. She was light, so terrifyingly light. "It is over," he said, his voice breaking. "It is over." He carried them back into the shallow cave. He piled the furs around them. He sat with his back to the wind, enclosing them in his arms, rocking them as the storm howled its frustration outside. Clara leaned her head against his chest. Her breathing was shallow. "He is eating," she whispered, her voice slurred with exhaustion. "He is warm. You are the fire," Tybo said. He took her hand. It was ice cold. He rubbed it between his own, trying to transfer his heat to her. "Tybo," she said softly. "I am here. We are a strange family," she murmured. "Yes," Tybo said, looking down at the top of her head and the sleeping face of his son. "We are." He held them as the night deepened. The danger from the men had passed, but the danger from the cold remained. Tybo did not sleep. He stayed awake, a sentinel in the dark, keeping the blood flowing in their veins with the sheer force of his will. He watched the snow pile up at the entrance of their shelter, a white wall that shut out the world, leaving only the three of them in the small, warm pocket of existence they had carved out of the ice. Love, he realized, was not a soft thing. It was this. It was teeth bared in the wind. It was a breast bared in the snow. It was the refusal to let go when the whole world tried to tear you apart. The wind screamed on, but inside the shelter, the baby slept, his belly full of stolen milk and stolen time. The blizzard had scrubbed the world clean, leaving behind a landscape of blinding white silence. The wind, which had screamed like a banshee for 2 days, had finally exhausted itself, retreating into a sullen, cold stillness. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of sage and heated stones. It was a healing warmth, dense and protective. Clara May lay on the pallet behind the buffalo robe partition. She was pale, her skin translucent against the dark furs, looking as fragile as a piece of fine china that had been dropped and glued back together. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, deep rhythm. She had given everything in the storm, her heat, her milk, her defiance, and now she was hollowed out. Hetty, the midwife, moved around the small space with the authority of a general. She had arrived as soon as the drifts were passable, riding her mule through belly-deep snow. "She is drained," Hetty murmured, wringing out a cloth in a basin of hot water. "You cannot pour from an empty pitcher forever. Tybo, the cold nearly took her milk. It nearly took her mind." Tybo stood by the hearth, watching. He felt a helplessness that was heavier than any stone he had ever lifted. "Will she recover?" "She is a Mayfield," Hetty said, applying the warm cloth to Clara's forehead. "They are stubborn people. She will mend, but you must keep her warm. You must feed her fat and broth, and you must keep the wolves from the door. Stress will dry a mother up faster than a drought." Hetty turned to him, her dark eyes serious. "She chose this. Do not forget that. She walked into the ice for that boy. You owe her more than just a roof." "I know," Tybo said. The words were inadequate. He owed her a life, 2 lives, in the days that followed, as Clara regained her strength. Tybo channeled his gratitude into his hands. He could not speak the poetry of the white poets, but he could work wood. He selected a piece of seasoned cedar, straight-grained and aromatic. He sat by the fire while Clara slept and Connie cooed softly in the nest of blankets. Tybo carved. He worked with a patience he had not possessed in years. He smoothed the wood with sand and rough leather until it felt like satin. He was making a new cradle board. The old one was functional, but this one was a promise. On the backboard, where the spine of the child would rest, he carved a symbol, the morning star, the guide that brings the dawn, and below it, he carved the name, not in the white man's script, but in the pictographs of his people, intertwined with a flowing design that looked like milk, or perhaps water, sustaining the root of a tree. When Clara was finally strong enough to sit by the fire for a full evening, Tybo presented it to her. He did not wrap it. He simply held it out. "For him," Tybo said, "for when he is strong enough to see the world." Clara ran her fingers over the carving. She traced the star. She lingered on the symbols she did not understand but felt the meaning of. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "It looks strong." "It is Comanche," Tybo said, watching her face for a reaction. "But the wood is from the creek. It is of this land, like him." Clara looked up, her eyes meeting him. "And like us." It was a quiet claim. There was no ceremony, no drumbeat, but in that exchange, the boundaries of their arrangement shifted. Connie was no longer just Tybo's son whom she fed. He was their charge. The cradle board was a bridge between the teepee and the cabin, built by a father's hands and accepted by a mother's heart. But the peace inside the cabin was a fragile bubble. Outside, the world was regrouping. 3 days after the storm broke, a wagon rattled up the track. It was Abel Mayfield. Tybo stepped out onto the porch, his rifle in hand, but he left the barrel pointing at the slushy ground. Abel climbed down slowly. The older man looked aged. The lines around his mouth were etched deeper, and his shoulders slumped. "I brought flour," Abel said, his voice rough. He gestured to a sack in the back of the wagon. "And some cured ham. I figured you might be low." It was a peace offering, clumsy and small, but monumental coming from a man who had brought a shotgun to this same door a week ago. "Clara's inside," Tybo said. I know, Abel said. He kicked at a clod of mud. I saw Crow in town, at the barber shop. He was wearing a bandage on his neck. Told folks he slipped on the ice. Tybo remained silent. Abel looked up, and for the first time, his eyes held a flicker of steel instead of fear. I told him he was a liar, right there in front of the barber and the mayor. I told him he nearly killed my girl out on the flats. I told him if he ever came near her with a gun again, I wouldn't wait for the law. That was dangerous, Tybo said. A man can only be scared for so long before he gets tired. Abel admitted. I ain't saying I like this. Tybo, I ain't saying I understand it. You are everything I was taught to hate. But she chose you. Or she chose the boy. And she is all I have left. Abel hauled the sack of flour onto the porch. He paused, his hand on the rough burlap. Crow isn't done. He was meeting with the lawyer, Mr. Pemsley. They were looking at maps, looking at the county lines. He can't shoot you now, not after the storm. Too many people know Clara is alive, so he's going to use paper. He's going to try to bleed you dry with fines and wrists. Let him try, Tybo said. He will say you are unfit, Abel warned. He will say you are keeping a white woman in squalor. He will try to take the land by claiming you abandoned your treaty rights by harboring a fugitive. Watch your back, horseman. The ink is deadlier than the lead. Abel did not ask to see Clara. He wasn't ready for that yet. He climbed back into his wagon and drove away. A father trying to bridge a chasm one sack of flour at a time. Abel's warning proved true within the week. A courier from the county seat arrived. A nervous young man who threw a packet of papers onto the porch and rode off as if the cabin were plagued. Tybo could read enough to understand the shape of the weapon. It was a summons. Petition for removal. Unlawful occupation. Endangerment of a minor. Crow was accusing Tybo of kidnapping, of holding Clara against her will under the influence of heathen narcotics, and of raising a child in conditions unfit for a citizen of the state. The court date was set for 3 weeks hence. If Tybo lost, he would lose the land. If he lost the land, he lost the horses. If he lost the horses, he and Connie would be beggars on the reservation, and Clara would be dragged back to her father's house in shame. Tybo sat at the table, the papers spread out like a map of enemy territory. He wants a fight he knows I cannot win. Tybo said, I cannot speak his law language. I have no money for a lawyer. Clara picked up one of the documents. She read it, her brow furrowing. He is using the morality statutes. He is counting on the town's prejudice to do the work for him. He thinks you will run. I do not run, Tybo said. Then we must fight him with his own greed, Clara said. She looked at Tybo. Crow wants the land because of the water, but he also wants money. He has gambling debts in Abilene. Everyone knows it. We can buy him off. We can buy time. With what? Tybo asked. I have 3 horses and a mule. You have the stallion, Clara said softly. Tybo stiffened. The paint stallion was his heart. It was the only thing of value he possessed, the envy of every rancher in the county. No, Tybo said. Tybo, Clara said, her voice firm. It is a horse. Connie is a boy. We need 6 months. In 6 months, the harvest comes. In 6 months, the baby is weaned to solid food. We just need to survive until the spring grass is high. It was a cruel choice, the kind the West demanded daily. The next morning, Tybo rode the stallion to the edge of the settlement. He met with the livery owner, a man who acted as a broker for the region. He did not go to Crow directly. That would be a weakness. He sold the stallion. He sold the horse for $150, half its worth, but enough to pay a lawyer in the county seat to file a stay of proceedings, and enough to pay the fines Crow had fabricated for livestock wandering. As he handed the reins over, the stallion nickered and butted Tybo's chest. Tybo did not look the animal in the eye. He cut a lock of the horse's mane and put it in his pocket. It felt like cutting off a finger. He walked back to the cabin, saddle over his shoulder. Nokoni was waiting for him by the creek. The warrior sat on his pony, watching Tybo walk. Nokoni's face was a mask of disgust. You walk like a slave, Nokoni said. I saw. You gave the spirit horse to the fat man. For what? For paper. For a white man's permission to sleep on your own ground. I bought safety, Taibo said, not breaking his stride. You bought shame, Nokoni shouted. You are soft, Taibo. The woman has made you soft. You should have cut Crow's throat in the snow. Now you feed him your best horse. You are no longer Comanche. You are a pet. Taibo stopped. He dropped the heavy saddle into the mud. He turned to his cousin. To kill is easy, Nokoni, Taibo said, his voice low and dangerous. To die is easy. I could have killed Crow, and then the soldiers would come, and Connie would die. Is that strength to let your bloodline end because of pride? He walked up to Nokoni's pony and grabbed the bridle. I sold the horse so my son can sleep in a bed instead of a grave. I swallow my pride so he does not have to swallow dirt. That is not softness. That is the hardest thing a man can do. It takes more courage to plow a field for a future than to ride into a lance for a memory. Nokoni stared at him. The wind ruffled the feathers in the warrior's hair. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the creek. The boy better be worth it, Nokoni said finally. He pulled the pony's head away. The winter is not over. We will see if your paper shield holds. Nokoni rode off, but he did not spit on the ground this time. He rode with the confusion of a man who sees a new kind of war he does not understand. Taibo returned to the cabin empty-handed but heavy with resolve. Life fell into a new rhythm. The crisis of the storm faded into the grind of daily survival. But something fundamental had changed inside the walls. Clara was no longer a guest. She stopped asking permission. She took over the space. She organized the supplies. She learned to grind the corn the way Taibo's mother had. Using the stone medita, she learned to scrape hides, her hands becoming stained and rough, losing the softness of the town. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she pointed to the water bucket. Pa, she said. Taibo looked up from his mending. Yes, Pa. And the fire, she asked. Kuna, he answered. Kuna, she repeated, testing the sound on her tongue. And family. Taibo looked at her. The firelight danced in her eyes, which were no longer haunted, but clear and determined. Numunu, Taibo said. It means the people. But it means us. Numunu, Clara whispered. I am staying. Taibo, not because I'm hiding, not because I'm afraid, but because this... She gestured to the room, to the baby sleeping in the new cradle board, to the rifle by the door and the drying herbs. This is real, out there, in the town. It is all pretending. Here, we keep each other alive. It is a hard life, Taibo warned. Crow will not stop. The winter will come again. Let it come, Clara said. I have a good teacher. The intimacy between them had been growing like a root system under the frost, silent, unseen, but deep. It was not the fiery, desperate passion of the novels the townswomen read. It was a slow accumulation of shared glances, of accidental touches, of the sound of breathing in the dark. It happened 3 weeks after the storm. The night was cold, but the cabin was warm. Connie had been fussy, teething perhaps, and they had both been awake for hours, passing him back and forth, walking the floor. Finally, the baby had settled, his heavy eyelids closing, his breathing deepening into sleep. Taibo laid him in the cradle board. He straightened up and turned. Clara was standing right behind him, holding a cup of coffee she had kept warm near the coals. They were close, too close. Taibo could smell the scent of milk and wood smoke that was now her signature. He could see the fatigue in the purple shadows under her eyes, but also a raw, undeniable beauty. She did not step back. He is sleeping, she whispered. Yes, Taibo said. His heart was beating a rhythm against his ribs that had nothing to do with exertion. You look tired, Taibo, she said. She reached out, her hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before touching his cheek. Her fingers were rough now, calloused from work, and the sensation sent a shiver through him that was sharper than any pain. I am not tired, he lied. I am... He trailed off. He didn't have the word. He was terrified. He was exhilarated. He was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, Realizing he wanted to jump, Clara moved her hand to the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. She pulled him down. It was a gentle pressure, a question. Tybo answered. He leaned in. Their lips met not with a crash, but with a soft, trembling collision. It was tentative at first, a testing of boundaries, a tasting of the impossible. Then, Clara made a small sound in her throat, a sound of release, and pressed closer. Tybo wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. The kiss deepened. It tasted of coffee and longing. It was the release of months of grief, of fear, of holding back. It was a claim. They stood there in the firelight, the warrior and the settler's daughter, clinging to each other as the wind rattled the door. They were kissing not just out of desire, but out of defiance. They were alive. They had cheated death, and in the warmth of that embrace, Tybo realized that he had not just saved a baby. He had found a reason to endure the world. He pulled back slowly, resting his forehead against hers. Their breath mingled in the quiet air. "Crow will use this," Tybo whispered. His eyes closed. "If they know." "Let them talk," Clara said fiercely, her hands still gripping his shirt. "They only have words. We have this." She kissed him again, shorter this time, but with a promise in it. "We have this," she repeated. Tybo looked over her shoulder at the cradle board where Connie slept. The morning star carved into the wood seemed to catch the flicker of the firelight. The falling action had begun. The adrenaline of the chase was gone. But the real work, the work of building a life, of defending a home, of loving a woman the world said he should hate, was just beginning. And for the first time since his wife died, Tybo did not feel the cold. 3 summers had burned the Texas grass gold, and 3 winters had frosted the creek banks since the blizzard that almost took them. The cabin did not look the same. It had grown, expanding outward like a living thing. There was a proper lean-to for the firewood, a fenced garden where squash and beans climbed aggressively toward the sun, and a new corral where a young colt practiced his bucking. Connie was no longer a bundle of desperate need. He was 3 years old, a whirlwind of brown skin and black hair, who ran barefoot across the hard-packed earth with a speed that terrified the chickens. He did not walk. He tumbled through the world. "Gia, Gia!" The boy sprinted from the creek, holding a muddy frog like a trophy. He ran straight to Clara, who was hanging wet sheets on the line. She caught him before he could wipe the mud on the clean linen, laughing as she swung him up. "Gia," she corrected gently, wiping a smudge of dirt from his nose. "You are supposed to be catching fish, not frogs. Little star." He giggled, squirming to be let down. He called her Gia, the Comanche word for mother. It had not been taught. It had simply happened. A natural evolution of language in a house where English and Comanche wove together like the strands of a rope. Tybo watched them from the stable door. He was mending a harness, the leather supple in his hands. The sight of the boy in Clara's arms no longer brought the sharp pang of grief for his late wife. That wound had scarred over, tough and resilient. Instead, it brought a warmth that settled deep in his chest, steady as a heartbeat. The fear that had once defined their lives, the fear of Deputy Crow, the fear of the town, the fear of the cold had retreated. It had not vanished, for the West did not allow fear to vanish entirely. But it had lost its teeth. Silas Crow was no longer a man to be feared. His fall had not come from a bullet, but from a ledger. A circuit judge from Austin, a man with ice-water eyes and no patience for frontier corruption, had audited the county books 6 months ago. He found the phantom fines, the stolen land deeds, and the bribes skimmed from the cattle drives. Crow had been stripped of his badge in a public hearing that humiliated him more than any beating could. Now, he sat on the porch of the saloon, drinking cheap whiskey, a bloated, bitter man who shouted at stray dogs. The town, once so eager to follow his hate, now stepped around him like he was a puddle of mud. They had seen Tybo trade honestly for 3 years. They had seen Clara May raise a child with her head held high. The truth of their quiet, dignified survival had worn down the sharp edges of the community's prejudice. Even Abel Mayfield had found a way to bridge the gap. Later that afternoon, a wagon creaked up the path. Connie stopped his running and hid behind Clara's skirts, peering out with wide, dark eyes. Abel climbed down. He moved slower now, rheumatism settling into his joints. He carried a small burlap sack. He walked up the porch steps, taking off his hat as he approached Tybo. "Afternoon, Tybo," Abel said. "Abel." Tybo nodded. The older man turned to Clara. He looked at the boy peeking out from behind her dress. Abel reached into his pocket and pulled out a wooden whistle, carved from ash. "For the boy," Abel said, his voice gruff. "If he is going to make noise, he might as well be in tune." Connie looked at the whistle, then at Tybo for permission. Tybo nodded. The boy darted forward, snatched the whistle, and blew a shrill, piercing note before running off to terrorize the dog. Abel chuckled, a dry sound like leaves rustling. "He has lungs. That is good." He sat on the bench, wiping his forehead. "I saw the new marshal today. He asked about the water rights on the South Creek. I told him that land belongs to my grandson, in all but blood." Clara put a hand on her father's shoulder. It was a peace offering. Abel was not a saint. He still muttered about the unnaturalness of it all when he was in his cups, and he still flinched when Tybo spoke Comanche. But he had learned a hard lesson in the storm. A living family that defies convention is better than a respectable tombstone. He had chosen his daughter over his pride. "Stay for supper, Papa?" Clara said. "We have a rabbit." "I might," Abel said, settling back. "I just might." The acceptance from the other side of Tybo's world came more quietly, like a shadow passing at dusk. A week later. Tybo was checking the fence line when Nokoni rode by. The warrior did not dismount. He sat on his pony, watching Connie practice shooting a small bow at a hay bale. The boy's form was perfect, knees bent, arm steady. Nokoni looked at Tybo. The disdain that had been there 3 years ago was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. Tybo had not returned to the blanket, but he had not become white either. He had carved a third path, a difficult, lonely path that required more courage than a raid. "The wolf cub has teeth," Nokoni said in Comanche. "He is strong." Tybo replied, "He walks like the people." Nokoni admitted, "You kept the fire, Tybo, even in the white man's wooden box. I was wrong to say you were lost." Nokoni kicked his pony and rode on. It was not an embrace, but it was an end to the war between them. Tybo watched him go, feeling the last heavy chain of the past fall away. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and orange, Tybo and Clara walked down to the creek. The air was sweet with the smell of damp earth and sage. They carried a sapling, a young cottonwood tree, its roots wrapped in burlap. They dug the hole together, their shovels biting into the soft soil of the bank. They placed the tree on the earth, packing the dirt around it firmly. It was a marker, a living stake in the ground that said, "We are here. We will grow." Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a strip of blue wool. It was a piece of the shawl she had worn the night she knocked on his door, the shawl that had covered her when she fled the storm. With trembling fingers, she tied the blue cloth to one of the slender branches of the sapling. It fluttered in the breeze, a small flag of memory. "For him," she whispered. She did not need to say the name of the son she had lost. The grief was no longer a drowning wave. It was a quiet stream that ran alongside her life. "He led you here," Tybo said softly. "His spirit brought the milk." Clara nodded, wiping a single tear from her cheek. She touched the cloth one last time, then turned to Tybo. The sadness was there, but it was outweighed by the life standing in front of her. They walked back toward the cabin. Near the gate, Tybo stopped. He had been working on something in the shed for weeks, hiding it under a tarp. He pulled the canvas away. It was a sign, made of heavy, polished oak. He had burned the letters into the wood with a hot iron. It did not say Mayfield, and it did not say Tybo's place. It read, Root wind. Clara looked at it, tilting her head. The root holds the earth, Tybo explained, his voice rough with the vulnerability of the moment. The wind moves the seed. One cannot live without the other. If you are just wind, you are lost. If you are just root, you do not grow. He looked at her. We are both. Clara traced the burned letters. Root and wind, she repeated. It is a good name. It sounds permanent. Tybo reached into his belt. I have one more thing. He pulled out a small knife. It was not a weapon of war. It was a tool, a woman's working knife, but the handle was exquisite. He had carved it from the antler of a stag, smoothing it until it shone like ivory. On the pommel, he had inlaid a single turquoise stone the color of the sky, the color of protection. He held it out to her handle first. In the stories of my people, Tybo said, a man gives a horse to a father to buy a wife, or he gives blankets. He looked into her eyes, seeing the woman who had nursed his son, who had faced down a loaded gun, who had slept on a dirt floor to save a family that wasn't hers. I have no horses to give your father, Tybo said, and I do not want to buy you. You are free. He pressed the knife into her hand. Her fingers closed around the smooth antler. But a knife is for survival. He continued, it is for cutting meat, for cutting cord, for protection. I give you this because I do not need a guest, Clara, and I do not need a helper. He stepped closer, his hand covering hers over the handle of the knife. Stay, he whispered, not because you have nowhere to go. Stay as a family. Stay as the mother of my son. Stay as the woman who holds my heart. Clara looked at the knife, then at the sign, and finally at the man. The sun had set, and the twilight was settling over the plains, blue and quiet. I already chose. Tybo, she said, her voice steady and sure. I chose the night I knocked. I choose every morning I wake up and light the fire. I am not going anywhere. She tucked the knife into her sash. She reached up and pulled him down for a kiss. It was not the desperate kiss of the storm, nor the tentative first kiss of the cabin. It was a kiss of belonging, deep and easy, tasting of the future. They walked inside. The fire was banking down in the hearth, casting a warm orange glow over the room. In the corner, in a bed now, not a cradle board. Connie was asleep. He had kicked off his blankets, his limbs sprawled in the total, trusting relaxation of a child who knows he is safe. Tybo added a log to the fire. It crackled comfortably. Outside, the wind picked up. It whistled around the corners of the cabin, rattling the shutters. Once, that sound had been a threat. It sounded like wolves, like ice, like death. Now, as Tybo sat beside Clara, watching the flames dance, the wind sounded different. It was just the breath of the prairie. It was the music of the wide, open world, singing to the roots that held firm in the dark. They were an island of warmth in the vastness of the night. And that was enough. Thank you so much for listening to this story of Tybo and Clara May. I hope their journey touched your heart as much as it did mine writing it. If you enjoyed this tale from the frontier, please let me know in the comments where you are listening from. I would love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel Wild West Tales for more stories of love, grit, and survival. Please like this video and hit that hype button to help this story reach more people. Your support means the world to me. Stay wild and keep reading.